in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So, Mike, I was having another relaxing day thinking about how I don't have any problems at all. And I was thinking, like, it's got to be the same for you, man. Like, you have no problems in your life, just easy living. You know, you're on the government's dole or the government's tit or whatever it is these days, and you're just like living life, right?
Yeah, it's like that meme where the house is on fire and you're like, it's fine, I'm fine, everything is fine, this is fine.
So you'd say maybe that isn't accurate? You'd say that maybe there are problems?
Well, it's relative, right? Like, I mean, yeah. I might be fine in that moment, but getting out of the house could be problematic. And at some point, the roof's going to collapse, you know?
Yeah. So funny thing about problems, they're like fractal, like problems inside of problems inside of problems. In fact, one of my favorite things is wicked problems. Like, you can't even solve a problem because there's so many other problems tied into it that, like, you're just effed, right? Well, and it can feel helpless and hopeless, right?
There's also a dog training ism that we talk about a lot, which is every time you solve one problem, you create a new one.
Yes.
That comes up a lot too.
So how do you solve problems in the tactical environment? Is it just problem solving, but like painted camo? Is that how you do it?
Yeah, we don't really go camo anymore. Like Ranger Green probably is a little bit more something like that. But yeah, that's what I want to get into tonight is a little bit of problem solving, but specifically how we solve problems as teams. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about OODA Loop, decision-making cycle type stuff. And often when people look at OODA Loop, they're looking at it from a very individual perspective. How does an individual solve a problem? And in law enforcement, that's relevant in a lot of ways because often you're the only guy there, or you're the only guy that has that shoot, no shoot decision to make or whatever. But bigger picture, there is such a thing as how a team approaches a problem. And a team or an agency, institution, any of those things can also, as a group, have an orientation and approach problems a certain way. So in terms of problem solving as a team or as a group on an operational level, I want to get into how we look at OODA Loop from that perspective a little bit. And one of the things that special teams, if you want to look at like a SWAT team or tactical team and quote unquote tactics, if we're thinking about the fighting realm of tactics, it's really about dealing special or unique problems or specific problems at least. And we'll use the example of CQB or whatever you want to call building clearing or clearing a structure, clearing a house, right? It's a huge geometry problem. That's all it is fundamentally, right? There's a room entry, which is how do I approach this threshold and get into the room dealing with these angles as quickly and safely as possible. And then you have these collections of room entries and hallways and intersections and large rooms and It's all just about angles. Where is the bad guy going to be? When is he going to see me? What kind of shot does he have? And how do I limit my window of exposure and increase my ability to deal with that, right? It's just a big geometry problem. And I can look at that a number of ways. How do I approach clearing a house by myself, or with, like, if it's just me and Jim, like, hey Jim, can you come over? My house got broken into. I need to clear it real quick. Or if I'm using an entire team of guys to move through it, how I handle that geometry problem changes, right? So there's a lot of ways to slice that pie, haha, so to speak. But fundamentally, there comes a point that you can actually draw this out on a whiteboard and have a diagram or a blueprint of the floor plan and dissect that down to every tiny bit of detail and figure that out. But then you have to take that tabletop exercise, right? That little diagram that you drew, and you need to apply it to your team's training and to the experience of the group, maybe not just the people that were there or the individuals that dealt with that intersection within the structure, but you have to figure out what the best solution is for that kind of problem, and then expand that out to everyone on the team so that it becomes intuitive and implicit. And that's a big part of that OODA Loop thing, is making it intuitive and implicit.
So I like that. Thinking about CQB, clearing a house, in one sense, it's a nut-kicking contest. We're going to speed, surprise, violence of action this guy into submission or, incapacitation. But in the exact same scenario, it's really like a game of pool. You're working angles, right? So 2 different ways of ultimately solving the same problem, and you need both ways. And sometimes you need the guy on the team who is like, no, we're going to violence our way through this. And sometimes you need the guy on the team who's like, hey, wait a second, we got some angles we can work here to make sure you don't die while we violence our way through it. And balancing that in a team is a big deal. That's a big part of how you get a successful, high-functioning team. Because when you have all nut kickers in your door kickers, you're going to get a lot of violence. And some of that's going to come back on you, right? And if you have only little analytical engineer problem solvers, you're going to have analysis by paralysis, or paralysis by analysis, whatever it is. You're not going to do the things you need. Yeah. Some guy's going to be like, guys, the whiteboard. And you're like, okay, cool. We got to go. Right. So striking that balance, I think, is a big deal.
Yeah. And this is the thing, is that it's like any game of pool, right? You break, there's balls all over the table, and it's, so to speak, and it's never going to be exactly the same picture. And this is the same, it's the same thing every time you see a new floor plan. One of the problems that we run into a lot in training is, we're going to go clear our shoot house, which we've done thousands of times. Like, at some point that loses its novelty, right? And so you need to see new floor plans, and it's hard to find places you can use for training. And so some of that comes from real life. But every time you see a new floor plan, you can take the things that you knew up until that point, fuck it up, learn from your mistakes, cover it in the debrief, go with the diagram, do the whiteboard, whatever, and then try to figure out how you can apply that to future trainings or future events and shape future decisions.
And there's some magic in what you just said, right? That a big part of being a problem-solving organization is being a learning organization. And making that part of your culture of, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to screw it up, we're going to figure out what we screwed up about it, and we're going to fix it in the future.
Yes.
And that takes a operational maturity that is not as common as we'd like in the tactical communities.
Absolutely. Yep, very true. So in this sense, as it applies to OODA Loop, like that's one example. But we are talking about bringing institutional knowledge to bear and experience to bear in the context of OODA Loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act, to figure out the way that we, whatever group we're talking about, whatever team, whatever organization, this specific group, to figure out how we approach certain types of problems. And even within those teams or those groups or organizations, there's also subgroups, right? There's little subcommittees, if you will. So you've got the police department, right? Whatever, insert, hometown USA police department. That agency goes and handles problems a certain way. And then individual squads or divisions maybe within that agency handle it a certain way. And the SWAT team might handle it a certain way. And even a step further within the SWAT team, you might have the medics would handle this problem a certain way, or the breachers would handle it a certain way, or the snipers would have their own unique view on things. And seeing all these different approaches and looking, taking that step back and seeing that from the, 5, 10, 15,000 foot view, whatever, helps you evolve. And it helps you grow and kind of expand the options in your head to deal with it. One of the things that we always talk about in OODA Loop stuff, you'll hear people say it's like an index of solutions, right? It's not only what option you choose, it's the range of options available to you. And you'll hear people say things like, it's in your Rolodex, but then they say that I'm too old because most people don't even know what a Rolodex is anymore. Or they'll say add that file to your file folder or whatever, however you want to, a catalog of options, whatever you want to call that. But the idea is the more options that you've seen, the more you can figure out is this approach better for this or for that or whatever, right? And that's how you get new ideas and new perspectives.
Put that in your neural network database. So there are a handful of issues to unpack in what Mike just said. First off, a problem-solving team needs to be made up of problem solvers. In fact, compulsive problem solvers. When you're hiring people, you're looking for this, right? This is a trait that you can select and assess for. And this is a big deal because it's very tempting when you're looking at doing a hiring board or a selection board, looking for the best PT scores, the best resumes. Some of that matters. Performance ultimately matters, right? But I'm also looking for the guy who will recognize a problem, engage that problem, solve that problem, and who's willing to consider answers that weren't handed to him.
Or that he didn't come up with himself.
Exactly. And open-mindedness, right? And related to that, the growth mindset in general. Someone who's willing to take inputs, right? And that is part of what makes them coachable and part of what makes them a good problem solver. Now, the other thing, Mike laid out specialties and how specialties see things, how the breacher and the sniper see things. You need to recognize how specialization helps us and hurts us in problem solving. We want that diversity of background and diversity of experience and deep depth of knowledge. But people can and often do get so narrow in their focus that they fail to solve the overall problem. They can only see their little piece of it, right? And the wrong guy might inappropriately or inadvertently try to solve the problem with only the tool you trained him on. Right? When all you have is a sniper rifle, the whole world looks like a target. When all you have is an F-15, the whole world looks like a MiG-29. The right guy knows when their skill set or tool doesn't fit the problem, or when they need to go off script and use their tool or skill set in some, unconventional way. That is the kind of thing that gets you unconventional warfare and truly special tactics. Now, that doesn't mean always go weird, but you need the people who are willing to go weird, right?
Yeah, sometimes the most obvious, simple, fundamental solution is the right solution. But I think that's something important that Jim hits on because, a classic example of this for me is you're dealing with a hostage sort of scenario, and there is some contention between the SWAT guys that want to go do a rescue and the hostage negotiators or the crisis negotiators that want to arrive at a surrender, peaceful surrender, which is ultimately the goal, right? The goal is to get everyone out safely with the least possible injury or loss of life and all of that, of course. But when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And this is why integration is so important, because the perspectives that let's say a guy on a SWAT team might have is, hey, this is the safest opportunity that we can pull this off and make this effective, but we have to go right now if we're going to do it. If we wait longer, it's going to become a bigger problem. Crisis negotiators might have another perspective on it based on the dialogue they have with the guy, or what kind of headway they're making, or their assessment on, his general headspace and stuff like that.
And we've talked about this, right? We've talked about case studies like, I don't know, Waco, where to this day there's some disagreements on who should have gotten listened to between the tactical team and the negotiating team, right? And one thing I want to jump in with on this is plan in the open. If you're trying to solve all these problems right in your little headquarters or your tactical operations center or your command center, having only the incident commander and these two voices, one, can make you crazy, and two, like, you're not getting all of the ideas that you need in order to get a solution. Having reps, and maybe a couple of reps from each one of those tribes, might help you arrive at a better, smarter, more integrated solution.
That came up in the 79 Iran thing as well. Yeah. And it was a slightly different flavor. It wasn't about the specialization. It was, well, it kind of was, but a lot of it was each branch wanted their piece, right? Like,
yep.
The Army guys wanted in on it, the Marines wanted in on it, the Navy everyone wants in on it. So everyone needs to get their piece of it. And so, like, in some effort to be fair, we went with maybe less than stellar alternatives. Where I also see this taken a step further between tactical and crisis negotiators and stuff is the way the bomb squad would handle a problem. It usually involves the robot. The robot's kind of cumbersome and slow. Or canine. Like, it's easy for me to be like, well, we could throw a dog in there. But to Jim's point, it's also on me to be the guy as the sort of subject matter expert in the room on any given thing, to be like, this is not a dog call. Like, people might be thinking like, hey, can we use the dog for X, Y, and Z? And I need to know my trade well enough to be like, nah, man, this is not a great, first of all, like, he can't discriminate targets. It doesn't matter if it's a good guy or a bad guy, or maybe, it's just going to be a suicide mission. We're not really gaining anything by doing it that way. Or there's any number of things that we can sit there and go, this is not the best tool for this task. And that's part of that open-mindedness as well. And so, again, you get this from there's layers to this. And integration is such a big part of it, because that's what Jim, I think the point he's making is, you can be so specialized that you're just very narrow focused, right? What do they say? Like, so well-rounded, it has no point. It's like the opposite of that. Yep. So fast forward to any given day, you find yourself dealing with some new problem, right? Maybe you've seen a version of this sort of thing before, or you have some sort of template for it. And the example I'll use here is just a barricaded fugitive in a house. We call it a bad guy in a box, right? There's a difference between a sad guy in a box, a mad guy in a box, bad guy in a box. Bad guy in a box, right? No hostages, no mental health related. He's not in crisis. This is just a guy that does not want to go back to prison. I ain't coming out. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot it out with you, blah, blah, blah. Easy example. The goal or the mission of the task presented to us in that scenario is get the guy out of the house and into custody safely. Very straightforward. And we have a basic template for that. We're going to surround the guy, contain the house so he can't get away. We're going to evacuate the surroundings so no one else is in any kind of danger. We're going to try to get some dialogue with him and negotiate a peaceful surrender. And if that doesn't work, then we're going to start to do some agitation and essentially coerce his compliance, right? We're going to make it uncomfortable or send some sort of message to him that, like, no, really, time to come out, bud. Stir the pot a little, if you will. And we have done each of those steps as a team, depending on how long you've been on the team, hundreds or thousands of times in a lot of cases. But when you're looking at this house on this day, it might present its own problem. And how you approach that door or that window or this particular problem is unique. And so you have to be able to see the trade-offs of all the things available. Well, I want to break that window because we're going to tear gas this place. I can do that with a number of tools. Which one's going to work in this scenario? And what are the trade-offs? There's always trade-offs. You have to be able to see that. So the point of all of this discussion is to talk a little bit about how we approach those sorts of things and build our capacity of our team or our group, not just as individuals, to solve future problems. That's the goal.
So there's a procedural template to most of the problems you're going to face, right? There's almost never anything truly new under the sun. Someone has already faced it. In fact, your team has probably already faced it. Start by learning the templates. As one thought leader in Army Special Operations once said, you have to know the rules in order to break them, right? You have to start with the basic rules and the fundamental skills. Get that stuff down. But then you have to know them so well that you know the nuances. You know, okay, so this is how I go handle a door, but this is how I handle every kind of door, right? In order to build out your decision tree. When do they apply? When are those templates problematic? And when do I need to go off script?
Yeah, and the way you get there is with reps. That's the key thing. When we did our interview with Will Hudler and Ashton Pack, we did the Las Vegas shooting, Mandalay Bay interview with them, and we talked about that. And one of the things that I remember specifically Will talking about in terms of running into the gunfire is, you need reps, and some of those reps happen in your mind when you're problem solving possibilities and you're going through the what if game, and some of those happen in real life. But at the end of the day, the first big thing that you need to build your capacity for this is repetition. You need the experience. You need to be in a place where you know a thing or two because you've seen a thing or two. That's probably step one.
It's funny you mentioned that. In most of the cases that I can think of where there was a relatively good outcome from a major crisis, it was very often a busy agency that handled it well, right? Las Vegas, the San Bernardino metro shooting. And as far as getting that experience and getting those reps, if you don't have those reps, you need to recognize that. You need to recognize when you were deficient in this area. And what can you do about that? Can you bring in institutional knowledge from a neighboring agency or a regional training center? Can you bring in a consultant? Can you bring in a cadre? Can you have Mike and Jim from Tactical Tangents come teach you a thing or two? Because we're down. We'll do it. And bringing in outside perspectives and expertise can be huge for cracking tough problems, right? If you have one particular problem set that you're facing that you're not used to and you haven't built that good template for, go find someone who has and be aggressive about it. And next, what seasoning can you get? What can you get in a training environment? What can you get in an exercise environment? And what can you only learn in real life? And then start building your training and exercise environment around that to get you the reps and sets that you're going to need when the chips are down.
Yeah, and there's actually a couple ways to look at this as well, because for example, my K9 unit, we're a fairly busy agency compared to some of the smaller surrounding agencies. And we've got some of the smaller agencies that come regularly to our training days, or they come to us with help, when they need help with their dogs, or for new handler training, new dog selection, which is a big deal, because we've just had the reps. We've seen the failures. We've been there, and it's not any shortcoming on their part. It's just they realize that, hey, if you want to do it right, these guys, the proof is in the pudding, just because they've done it, right? So that help is out there, and I think it's important to seek that out. There's also something to be said about considering how other people handle problems. Like, one of the big ones lately for our agency has been with staffing. When I first started, I might have had, on a whim, I could get 10 or 20 cops to show up to just about anything. If it was big, if it was serious enough, I say the right words, I'm going to get the right help. But nowadays you might go to something and you're like, I need a couple more units for this, and it's crickets. Well, like those smaller agencies in rural towns, especially, they're used to that. They're used to, you got one other guy coming, he's 20 minutes out, by the way, or more. So how they approach a problem is also going to be different than how we would when we've got people on speed dial right around the corner, seconds or minutes away. So I think there's a lot to be said about learning that. So getting repetition and seeing the varying, the variance there is a big deal. So repetition, I think, is the big first key. The second thing is you need to be getting feedback and collecting feedback. Sometimes you don't have a coach, right? You don't have anyone that's there to necessarily reel you in when you need the help and get the feedback. But nowadays, things are all on camera. You can go back, you can watch it yourself, you can solicit opinions, but you need to get feedback somehow. And in a lot of cases, we learn lessons the hard way. And that's the reason that we say that some rules and some lessons are written in blood. And I got a debrief from a federal team that was serving a warrant. I just got this debrief last week. They were serving a warrant a few years ago, and a couple of their guys got shot through the door during the knock on this warrant service. And they came and they shared their lessons learned. This is not something that we haven't trained for or seen some version of in the past, but in this particular case, some of their guys got hit, and they shared their lessons that they learned the hard way. And there's a lot wrapped up in that, right? Not just in terms of how they approach the door or anything in that particular case, but also in how they handled the mental preparation side of things of, hey, we've done these kind of like immediate action drills and rehearsals on what if a guy goes down at the front door. How did that pan out? Like, was the expectation reality there? And the mental preparation side of it, and the aftermath, both the good things and the bad things in terms of like, how did the aftermath of this affect not only the guys, but the team? And one thing that came up was specifically like for that guy to approach the next door that he had to go approach. How did that affect things? And how do we as a team help facilitate or bring someone, reintegrate someone in that sense? Because here's the thing is your agency might have a process for that, but does your individual team have their own version? Because agency reintegration to go do regular police or patrol work might not be the same as a tactical team, right? So they shared a bunch of these lessons, and it was really good information. It was enlightening for sure. But again, it's another version of how we collect feedback from stuff, and we think, man, we've done this one thing, a billion times, and how could it have gone worse if we were in a different spot or if we didn't get lucky, right? Luck is not a tactic. So sometimes those are good lessons. Sometimes we look at things and we go, oh, okay, I'm glad we do it this way for something like this, right? And we want to reinforce that. And other times it's ways that we go, hey, maybe we should tweak this a little bit. Yeah. So somehow you got to collect feedback. Repetition, feedback.
And there's a saying in Jobs of Consequence that you aren't going to live long enough to make all these mistakes yourself, right? So one, when we do mess up, I only want to learn that lesson once. And I want to learn that lesson from somebody else, ideally, right? That's one of the reasons we do this podcast. That's why I'm aggressive about AARs, after action reviews, and debriefs at work. The difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. I stole that from Mythbusters, so I know it's true. Okay. Capture the lessons in writing so the next guys have a template to apply, and also go find the lessons. Like the crosstalk is a big deal between agencies, having the feds come out. Anytime there's a big critical incident debrief from a major event, capture that. And sometimes that's tough. Sometimes people don't want to open their kimonos all the way, right? They're trying to protect the innocent, protect the guilty, protect their agency's reputation,
dignity, and all that. Yeah,
dignity,
pride,
which I get it, or trade secrets, operational security. Cool, fine, but we got to do something to make sure the good guys know what right and wrong looks like, right?
Absolutely, and I think that was one of the big things about this was, their willingness to come out and be vulnerable and talk about this stuff is something that you can't put a price tag on. Because if you turn that into a bad experience, or you go and you shit on another agency or group, you're never going to get that kind of thing again. And the other thing is, if you show a little vulnerability and you're willing to share, right, like that, it will often be reciprocated. And this is one of those like relationship building things that you have to like embrace. And it's not something that you can't really cold call somebody and be like, hey, can you come tell us about that incident? Like, it's usually something that is built upon over time. And eventually they're like, yeah, I'll come down there and I'll give you guys an overview of it. So I think that's huge. The next big one that I think is important is we've really got to work hard to challenge ourselves. You have to operate on the edges of your comfort zone. If you only get stuck in the routine, if you're only used to doing things one way or a couple of ways, and for whatever reason you hear about people doing things different ways and you're like, we don't do that around here. Like, we don't. And maybe you have your reasons, maybe you don't. But part of that growth mindset that Jim was talking about earlier is being willing to experiment a little bit and give it a go. I mean, let's do it live. Let's load up some Sims rounds or, UTM rounds, marking cartridges, and let's see how it plays out. Let's just give this a shot. You have to be willing to challenge yourself and push yourself to grow.
And parts of that are cultural, right? Again, you want a team of problem solvers, but they're also organizational.
And can I also add, like, problem solvers, yes, but also innovators and creative people. Like, one of the things that I've gotten a lot of criticism for over the years is, like, I tend to be on that margin of the normal distribution of people where, like, I want to do the innovative, creative thing, and it gets me running around in 1,000 directions. I'm like, ooh, squirrel, shiny object. I go this way, that way, the other way. And Jim gives me shit for this all the time.
Yeah, I do.
And on the other end of that bell curve, right, are the people that are, stuck in their ways and they're very rigid and regimented, and there's no other way that we're going to solve this problem. We have to do it the old fashioned way all the time, no matter what. And there's a balance. Those personalities balance each other out, right?
Yes, and this is also a leadership thing.
Yeah.
Someone needs to say, no, it is time to make some changes around here. And someone needs to say, hey, so I look around the room and I see 50 half-done science projects. Why don't we get back to fundamentals for a little bit, right?
Right. But that's one of those cultural things I think is built into that.
And driving that culture and setting it, right? And that's part of your organizational leadership. One thing that you can do is assign roles within the team in addition to their basic, assignments. But who on your team is doing tech development? It's the 21st century. Tech's part of it.
Yeah.
Tech is part of most of the problems you're ever going to face for the rest of your life. Just accept it now, right? So who do you have who's figuring out how to integrate data and learning and AI? Because you're gonna need to, right? Who on your team is doing tactics development? The choreography of where we go and what we do and how we handle, the top 3 most common, most dangerous problems that we're going to face. Who on your team is doing people development? Who's doing the training? Who is doing the professional development? You need people who are pushing the boundaries on that. That's going to help you build that team of problem solvers. And that might sound simple, but I've very rarely seen that done in a balanced and deliberate way. Often what I see is we hired a bunch of compulsive problem solvers, and you look around the building and you see 5,000 half-done science projects. And they can't stay on task because they start solving a problem and then it gets hard. And then they get distracted by the next crisis, or they run out of resources.
Yeah.
Or you get a bunch of Band-Aid fixes. These people found some MacGyver duct tape and baling wire solution and never actually solved the problem that
they just took it off the immediate
happening. Radar. Yeah. Just so they can move on to the next crisis, right?
It's no longer, we're constantly stuck at 5 meter targets, right? The thing that's 5 feet in front of us or 5 meters in front of us, instead of thinking out past, 50, 100 yards or whatever, longer term. I think that's a big deal. And I also think in organizations like we're talking about, where we're compulsive problem solvers, one of the things that management and leadership can get very used to, and this is 100% true in the groups that I've worked with, is guys are motivated and go-getters and all of that enough that they'll solve a lot of problems on their own.
Yep.
And there's potentially like a quality control element in there you have to watch out for.
Duct tape and baling wire.
But right, there's that. But also, they're not. At some point, you burn those guys out, and they're not really getting the support they need. And really, what they need to be focused on are other elements of their job potentially than constantly getting pulled in 1,000 different directions. Like that is not necessarily the most efficient way to deal with some of this stuff.
Oh, yeah. And it's addictive as a leader. When you have guys who are just kind of making things happen, like that's fun. You don't have to solve their problems, and that's good. But sometimes you need to step in and get some resources moving or get some outside help. And
it's addictive for leadership on a couple levels. On one hand, a lot of the smaller scale stuff that those guys will deal with lets you focus on, getting the funding for something for real, like that will really make a difference. And that can be a good thing. But you just need to recognize that like, hey, maybe like the bigger thing that we can do here is make it a line item in the budget and actually solve this the right way.
Yeah. So one thing we need to hit on here is like the basic problem solving process. And there are, 100 problem solving processes in circulation. You can Google those. There's, all the different management hacks for that. There's the military templates for how to solve a problem, the military decision-making process, the MDMP, and there's the joint planning cycle, and there's METTC and how we do op boards and how we do, orders development. And those are great, and you can Google those. But I want to touch on just a couple key points, right? Identify the problem and understand the problem. What's the issue here? What are the underlying problems driving that? And when you're looking for root causes, you sometimes have to root into those causes. There's a saying like, ask why 7 times. Well, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? And it's annoying, but the point is you have to really understand the layers below the surface, right?
Yeah, you process through it and you understand some of the nuance, and you just talking through it helps you understand that, like, well, it brings clarity to it, right? A little bit more granular in that sense.
And can you draw out the problem? Like, literally, can you diagram it in some understandable way so that everybody in the room understands the problem the way you understand the problem? And can you break the problem into smaller problem pieces? I may not be able to solve all of it all at once, but I can start working on it if I can solve this first thing and this wicked problem, right?
I think identify the problem is one way of wording this, but this is one other way that I would also word this, which is define the objective, right?
What am I trying to do here? I love it. Yep.
And this is a big deal because I'll give you an example that in the tactical world has big consequences, right? If you think about a terror attack or an active killer scenario or something like that, often law enforcement is predisposed to think of approaching that problem in a criminal justice sense. Arrest the person, capture the person, apprehend the person. Even though that might involve shooting the person, it is still a different mindset than close with and kill that guy, right? Like, stop the killing, stop the dying. And there's a bit of clarity that comes with making that objective crystal clear, right? Because when you go back and when you scale away and you look at this problem, as Jim is saying, like, okay, can we do a diagram? Can we ask why 7 times? All these things that he's talking about, you can go back to that and you could be like, hold on, what's the goal here? And either the goal is, if the goal is off, then we need to reshape that, like redefine that, or we need to get back to focus on that. And an example of this, I'll go back to my barricaded fugitive example that we talked about a little bit ago. Let's suppose, I'll give you an example that I can remember pretty clear off the top of my head, which was we had a barricaded fugitive, but he had a 6-month-old baby in the apartment with him. And he had made these kind of, you could say vague sort of threats to harm. He was holding the baby as sort of a token of his safety. He knew that we weren't going to do much with the baby there, right? And so although the objective was get the bad guy out safely and in custody, there was this like kind of bigger priority of, no, get the kid out. We could deal with the dude later. Right now, the kid is the priority, and making sure that everyone is very clear about, and this is one of those earlier I talked about the tactical team. Sometimes we'll kind of, there'll be some contention with the negotiators about like, which way do we want to go with this? Because there are certainly times where the negotiators are like, we think we're getting somewhere with this guy. And we're like, that's cool. It's 110 out here. Let's gas the place. But this was one of those scenarios where everyone on the tactical side of the house was like, you guys got to get him to set that kid outside. That's the goal. So identifying the problem, another big part of that, like point A on that is
absolutely define success.
Yeah.
And this
what is the desired outcome?
Yeah. This is especially important when you're communicating to externals. If you're hiring a contractor to build you a new widget to fix your problem, you have to say, and this is my desired end state. This is what success looks like to me. And there might be a dialogue there. Like you might learn that you are deluded as far as your expectations go, and what's possible and what's feasible. And it's better to figure that out now than getting further down this checklist, right? Next thing you need to do is do some research. Okay, so you know what your problem is, you know what you're trying to do, go do your homework. Where has this problem come up before, and what did other, maybe smarter people do about it? And also, when you're doing that, figure out what's different about your unique situation. So, maybe they solved it one way in World War II, but maybe firebombing the city isn't on your list of acceptable outcomes, right? Do some research. And now you have to come up with possible solutions, brainstorming, right? And there are lots of different ways you can brainstorm. I like a whiteboard. I just jot stuff down, just ideas or bullet points. Plan without constraints. That's a big one. Just assume you've got $1 billion in total political buy-in. That will help you.
Yeah.
So if you did have all that, how would you solve it? Mike and I both like this saying. We stole it from the Israeli intelligence services. Let the crazy guy talk. Right? Plan without constraints. This is when you want that. You want that free, open dialogue. You want all the crazy, dumb ideas, right? Sort them out later.
Because it's iterative, right? Like that might not be the answer, but it might be a step in the direction that starts nudging us towards something that's viable.
She may not be the right girl, but maybe she's got friends, right? Like it gets you down the right path, right? When you think of solutions, I want you to consider a bunch of different domains, right? This is partly to help you just consider how wide your solutions might be. Is there a tech solution? Is there a procedural solution? The military, and this is one of the few things I think the military actually has figured out pretty well, busts this into an acronym called .milpf. .milpf, because it's fun to say, is a doctrinal term, and it's the things the military wants you to try before you buy an F-35 to solve your problems, right? That's before weird. You do the $800 billion buy, they want you to be like, but have we thought about maybe just
using an F-16?
Using an F-16. Maybe we can change the way we fight with the F-16.
That's where the military has an acronym for this kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. Weird. Or maybe there's an organizational change. Maybe I can double up my squadrons or cut my, squish all my squadrons together, right? Training. Can I teach those Viper drivers how to drive their Vipers better? Materiel. Is there some stuff that maybe we could strap onto the F-16? Maybe a better jammer that makes it just as stealthy as an F-35. Well, dang, you figure that out. That's worth a couple $1 billion to the government.
A couple?
With inflation. Leadership and education. Maybe I can change how the leaders do business, right? Maybe there's a personnel change. Maybe I need to hire more people or different people. Maybe the next F-16 pilots, I need to select a different type of person to drive them. Facilities. Maybe this is a thing where I build a different building to do my tests and training in. that might help my problems in the future. So, doctrine, organization, training, materiel, leadership and education, personnel, facilities. Now, is that going to help you handle this new, active shooter scenario? Probably not. But when you're laying out possible options, like look down each one of those paths and just make sure you've explored the space, right?
I think it absolutely does apply, though, if you're thinking about it from a training, leadership, management perspective. I mean, it's starting with the doctrine there, right? Like that's a big part of
how we do business.
Yeah.
Right?
How do we look at active killer problems? And then all the things that you need to kind of account for are built into those things.
And now, ultimately, you need to start narrowing down your possible outcomes, your COAs, courses of action. And this is where we get to the military decision-making process. I'm going to develop 3 COAs, and I'm going to war game them, and we're going to brief it to the general, and number 2 is the one we want, and we're going to give 2 obviously bad options, so the general picks what we want, right? It's not how it's supposed to go. So get down to maybe 3 options, and you do need to weigh the options. You need to figure out what's the best of those, what's the worst of those, and why, right? So test the solutions any way you can, as scientifically as you can, and as thoroughly as you can. And when you're evaluating those options, give some thought to whether you can settle for something expedient and minimally viable, the satisfactory option, or whether you need something robust or optimal or permanent. Because that's going to drive, right, how you value these different options that you've considered.
And there's an important part in this as far as weighing that last bit specifically. Does my hasty option work, or do I need to go for a perfect plan? And an example of this might be you show up at the hostage crisis scenario and you get your first crisis team set up right away because circumstances might happen that you just have to go, like right now. You can't wait. That's it. You put that in place while you start working on the perfect scenario, the perfect outcome, right? But you have to have that hasty plan. You have to have that emergency crisis team ready to go. And then you can start worrying about, okay, well, can we get keys to parts of the building? Can we look at, who can tell us about the floor plan? Who can do this? Who can do that? But circumstances might drive those choices for you at some point. And then your options become very, very easy. It's a very simple decision at that point. You have to go, so you just go. So I also think that if you, let's say, narrow it down to 3 options, you also have to consider the viability and or consequences of doing nothing, or let's wait and see. Let's give this some time. Those options also count, and they count in a couple of different ways. Sometimes time has a way of just resolving things by itself and let's just do nothing and let's wait and see. Let's reevaluate in a little bit. But also you need to consider, well, if I do nothing, what are the risks associated with that, right? Like if I don't act, right, that's a decision as well. And if
Absolutely.
People are in there getting hurt or killed and I don't go, that's not acceptable. So you have to weigh that in both directions, if that makes sense.
And it's a different episode, but this is exactly where you start applying your operational risk management, where you start saying, this is how likely this course of action could go wrong, and this is how severe it's going to go if it does go wrong, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere in there, you got to make a decision. Pick one and try it. Give it give it a full effort try, and be willing to fail. Like, it may not work at first. And think about how far you're willing to go with that before you're going to shift gears, right? So be willing to fail, but you got to learn from that. Now, one question from this is, can you do this whole decision-making, problem-solving process in the middle of an evolving tactical situation? Sometimes, actually, yes, you can. Sometimes you've only got time for one deep breath. Do I need to go? Yep, off we go.
Yep.
Right.
Well, see you later.
Sometimes violence of action is the problem solver. I asked a bunch of smart people I know, like, how do you solve problems? And they're like, I attack. And like, well, I like that.
Yeah. Because in terms of adaptability, like if you go, every time something changes, then you can make a new decision and you can adapt. It drives the whole thing, right? The whole situation drives because of decisions that you're making. And that is going to give you initiative, which definitely has its place.
And this is also where the operational art comes in and why we value experience, right? Because you need to develop the judgment to know when to speed things up and when to slow things down and go through a deliberate problem-solving process. And more often than not, you can slow things down. And slowing things down is a course of action. You can choose to make this go slower, right? Or feel slower, right? Mm-hmm. So I was thinking through this, how do we practically apply this? There's, I've got flying stuff. Mike has SWAT stuff. I'll give you kind of a practical personal security thing that I'm going through right now. I have a problem, Mike. I have a piece of land that I recently acquired, wooded area, rural area, and I threw some trail cameras up on it just to kind of see what the situation is with mostly the wildlife. And I have some no trespassing signs, and I have a gate. And I've noticed that more days than not, randos are walking onto the property. In fact, one rando walked onto the property with a machete and a couple of dogs. And then I saw him a couple days later. And then I saw him at 11:30 last night on the cameras.
The correct pronunciation is a machete.
A machete. Mm-hmm. So I interpret that as a problem, right? So my problem, as I understand it, is trespassing.
Not a problem until you fuck around and find out, Jim.
That's right. Well, so that's really where this is going to go. It's not a problem until I make it a problem. I can just choose to ignore it, right? But I want to camp down there. I want to take my kids there. I don't want to have to worry about machete guys showing up, surprising me surprising him. Like, that would be awkward. And also, it's my gosh darn property. Get off my land, right? I have a right to it. I paid a lot of money for it. I want that to be my stuff, right?
For sure.
So that's my problem. My desired end state, I want him to not be there anymore. So I got some options. Yeah, I want him off my property. That's my problem and my issue. And my what success looks like is I don't see him on my cameras anymore. So I got to do some research, right? What are the trespass laws in my state? How many signs do I need to put up? How many gates do I need to put up? What are my rights in this condition? Who do I need to call? So I did a little of that. Brainstorming possible solutions. Obviously, go out there with my night vision goggles and my sniper rifle on the off chance that he just walks through my property again tonight. Screw a lot of that, mostly because of the mosquitoes. I'm an indoor kid. And also, like, I don't want to get in a gunfight on anything other than my own terms, and not over this cat and not over some pine trees. What else could I do? Booby traps. I could set up some claymores and some barbed wire and some punji stakes. That's great. Until one, my kid falls into them, or I get sued, or any number of things. I get prosecuted. None of that sounds fun to me. Okay. I could call the sheriff. And the sheriff is under-resourced and it is pretty busy. It turns out there's some crime in the world. Huh. And this is probably not their highest priority, but I'm going to call them anyway, it turns out. And I'm going to make sure they know what I know and they understand my problem and my desired end state. What else can I do? I don't live on the property. I should clarify that. So I can't just like camp out, or if I could, but
pain in the ass.
Pain in the ass. I got to go to work in the morning, right? I have a job. So what can I do? Can I change my .mil.pf, my doctrine, organization, training material? Well, maybe I could put up some more fencing. A fence across the front of my property, I've priced it out, is about $15,000. And that's just the frontage of my property. That's not all the acreage. But it might be a decent deterrent. Okay, cool. Maybe I put up more signage. Maybe I put up more trail cameras. Give them more things to steal, Maybe there's something else I could do to deter it. Maybe there's some better sign, something other than no trespassing that I could put up. Maybe maybe I could do some deception, like watch out for Jim's rattlesnake breeding, ground or something. You got to be careful when you do stuff like that. Like, you could get unintended consequences, but hey, let the crazy guy talk. What are my options, right?
I'd explode an ordinance in this area.
Which is actually true. It's not far from a big army range. There's probably cannonballs from the Civil War there.
That would be badass, by the way. Maybe that's why he's there. I bet you get some money for those.
Yeah, so ask why 7 times, right? Why is this dude here? Maybe he doesn't know that that's not his land. Maybe I haven't put up enough signage. Maybe he's got a grow operation on my back 40. Maybe he's poaching. Maybe he's homeless and he's like living there. Maybe his underground bunker is there. I don't know. But I also don't want to have to know at the end of the day. I don't want this guy to be my problem. I got to pick one solution and try it. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to keep working on it, right? I'm going to keep working on this until I get it to a desired end state. So right now, as we record this, my solution is talk to the sheriff. And he actually might be listening. Of course, I told him about our law enforcement oriented podcast. And I laid out my problems, and the lieutenant from the sheriff's office was very receptive and
gave him some stickers. It was a good day.
I gave him a sticker, and hopefully we're going to get this guy resolved. So that's where I'm at right now. And if that doesn't work, we'll try something else. Right.
Yeah.
So just as an example of like a real life problem solving that I'm going through this week, that is a little bit tactical.
I think Jim's example brings up an important final point that I want to throw out here and that is problem solving and shaping your capacity to solve problems like this require you to stay engaged. Sure, you can be the landowner that completely blows it off and is just like, well, whatever, like I could still go there whenever I want. Like I can kick them off whenever I want, because you have to establish that a little bit if you want it to be enforceable, right? And so like putting up the signs or putting up the fencing and, stuff like that is what's going to make it enforceable if you decide to go build a house there and you want to live there and keep people away from your land and your property. And similarly, in tactical settings like we're talking about, or in team settings, Jim talked a lot about the culture of the team, and I think that was a big one, and how we select and hire and retain people who are compulsive problem solvers and all of that. You have to be fully engaged in all of this, and nothing about the process or that capacity happens in a vacuum. And if you're passive about it, then you're complacent. That is the same thing as being complacent. I think that's an important thing to hit. So we have to work hard at looking for new ideas, looking for new methods, and even looking at new problems to figure out, like Jim mentioned the domains thing, which is, I think, a really big deal. One of the analogies that I use a lot when I talk about radio communication stuff with cops is like, hey, flip over to like the fire channels and listen to how they do a scene size up when they show up at a fire. Now, granted, they show up as an engine company of 4 guys, and so they always have one dude that's clearly in charge I get it. It's different, but it's a different domain. And you can maybe take bits and pieces of it. Maybe it's the way they describe stuff, or maybe it's the way, they format those transmissions, right? You can, LCAN or CAN report, conditions, actions, and needs. So look for new ideas, look at new problems and all of that. And Jim kind of alluded to this earlier, but you got to be thirsty about learning. It's just the biggest part of having a problem-oriented team, a problem-solving oriented team, is be thirsty and constantly look for it. So those are my four big things that we've covered. Were you need the reps, you got to be collecting feedback somehow, you need to work outside of your comfort zone and challenge yourself, and you need to stay engaged. Those are my big takeaways, Jim.
My final thought is a lot of problem solving starts with curiosity and humility, right? So I recognize I can't solve all the problems by myself, that I need other people to help me solve problems. I recognize I didn't grow up in rural America. I grew up in LA, and I don't have a lot of corporate knowledge, institutional knowledge on how to keep trespassers off my land. In where I grew up, you call the cops. That's the answer.
And it was your tiny little parcel that you're dealing with.
On my quarter acre.
I just need him to just go to the next one.
Yeah. Just be somebody else's problem down the street, right? It's LA. There's plenty of street. So one of the first things I did was had the humility to go ask people who know better, go talk to my cadre of bros who grew up in that kind of environment, who are like, oh yeah, well, make sure you get the signage, make sure you get the trail cam, make sure that you are talking to the sheriff and reporting it every time it happens. And then of course they had their standard hillbilly, like, well, yeah, use a shotgun, which different discussion for a different day. Thanks. But hey, at least they asked. But part of that is the planning the open and taking advantage of your resources, right? And that's a big part of problem solving, is knowing what resources you have and exploiting or leveraging them. That's all I got.
I do want to highlight, I know it was kind of buried in one of these points, but I also want to highlight the identify the problem, define the mission, define your success criteria, define the objective, whatever that is, and make sure that you can use that, whatever you come up with there. And that it does really help to write it down somewhere, but make sure that you use that to keep everything else grounded. You can always go back to that and reframe whatever you're looking at around the answers to those questions, whether you need to change the answers or get back to that fundamental.
Real quick. So, story. I went and talked to the sheriff, went to the sheriff's station, again, rural America. And so I walk into the sheriff's station and it reeks of weed, like hot boxed. As I walk into the sheriff's station, I'm like, well, this is interesting. I didn't expect this would happen. And I mentioned that to the lady at the front desk. And I'm like, woo, it smells like probable cause in here. And she's like, it's funny. People really, really, really want to smoke up before they go to court.
Yeah.
Which
we're talking about the cops or...
I didn't ask.
Just to be clear.
I'm just saying, like, my little naive, greenhouse self, like, I never anticipated that the inside of a law enforcement agency would smell like Red Hot Chili Peppers concert. So, or Dave Matthews or whatever. So that's all I got. It was just kind of an interesting experience, exposure to law enforcement. So I hope, if they are listening, I hope they know I'm thinking about them and hope they're safe out there. That's all I got.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.